Hello, everyone. My name is Salit Kark, and I'm a professor at the University of Queensland. And we also have here Peter Baxter, who is a
Hi.
senior research fellow at UQ. And we want to present to you a project we've been working on in the past 5 years or so to help save species on Australian islands. It's part of the Threatened Species Recovery Hub funded by the National Environmental Science Program, which is also called NESP, and the Commonwealth Government in close coordination with the Department of Environment at the government in Canberra. So this project was a really fascinating project with many different components. We'll tell you a bit about the project and then I will tell you about the people that took part of it. But our main goal is actually to show you how to use a brand new database that we've been working on in the last 4 or 5 years. It is the first national database of threatened species on as many Australian islands as we could find information for. And that has been a huge task, very rewarding, and hats off to Peter and Aaron and all the other fellows who have been advancing this in recent years. So Justine Shaw has been collaborating on many other components of the project, as well as this one, and Andrew Rogers is also a fellow on the project, and we're also part of the Center for Biodiversity and Conservation Science and belong to the Biodiversity Research Group. So we will give you our information, and I'm going to present to you a little bit about the project in general, saving species on Australian islands. If you have questions, please feel free to email me. And this is the link to our group webpage, where you will find the database quite soon. And the link will be under projects, and we'll mention that at the end of our presentation, and you'll know where to find the database, how to access it, and how to contact us if you have any questions for us about the database. So thank you for attending, and we hope it's going to be a useful experience for you to listen to this as you try to use, explore, and enjoy our database. So this is really a huge team project. These are some of the people who work with us on the project. A really key player in this database generation is Professor John Winarski, who is like one of the biggest natural history and you know conservation experts in Australia, and he knows probably more than anyone else in Australia what species occur on which islands. And we were fortunate enough to have John involved in this project. This is a picture from a workshop we spent together time in Tasmania, working on developing questions and analyzing information arising from this database and from other components of our project. And this is Andrew and Tim and Justine and some of our other colleagues collaborating on this project. This is a picture of our students and fellows, some of our students and fellows working with us on this project. And again, we have Leah and Junior, and Melissa and Junior was teaching us how to use Indigenous knowledge in backyard conservation and incorporate it into conservation. Junior comes from Bougainville, and Melissa's work on subantarctic islands, such as Macquarie. And Leah is still currently working. We're in 2020 in the month of November on Norfolk Island and looking at threatened plants and also how interactions with species like birds, some of which have disappeared and some which are invasive on the island nowadays, is actually shaping what we can do to help protect species on Australian islands. And a lot of these projects are featured in our little fact sheets on this webpage, Nest Threatened Species, which you can look at and further read about our projects. So, this is a huge project called Saving Species on Australian Islands, and it really aimed to compile, examine, and analyze data, and we study that data. It addresses both threatened and invasive species on Australian islands. It's a database of islands with threatened fauna and flora, and we've developed that database during this work. And you'll be surprised to hear that Australia has over 9,000 islands. That's a huge number of islands for Australia, which is also the largest island nation on the planet. So it's really a huge responsibility that we have to protect those island species, many of which are endemic, threatened, and some of which have already gone extinct. And we want to avoid future extinctions of further islands, such as on this island right behind me was one of the most beautiful islands we have in Australia, Lord Howe Island. So, we value our island, they're really treasured for Australia, but we also need to protect them. And in order to do that, we need the information, the data that is required to protect these islands and the species on them and the people living on the island that have such valuable and important information and cultures, and very often indigenous people that we respect on those islands. And we want to acknowledge all indigenous owners of the islands and the people living on them who have lived on them or traveled through them in the past, past, present, emerging, and respect, their elders and all those people on the islands with whom we've aimed to collaborate and to continue collaborating into the future, because a lot of the knowledge on how to manage those species and those ecosystems is found already with people who are living on those islands for thousands and thousands of years. So if we can learn to work and to respect those indigenous owners of the islands, well, everyone will benefit from that. And we've aimed to do that during this project, closely working with Indigenous people on some of Australia's most treasured islands. And we'll continue doing that into the future. So the project Saving Species on Australian Islands is also looked beyond the big database we'll be telling you about more today, and how to use its multiple case studies and how we can prioritize action for conservation on many islands and many different species. It's such a huge task. We've developed novel tools and approaches, and we've involved, as I said, those island communities, both Indigenous people and many other stakeholders and people living on Australian islands and making a living from Australian islands. And also, of course, the governments and councils and industry partners and the public and many, many other, stakeholders on those islands. Another very important outcome, which was a major goal of this project, is the training of multiple PhD students, master's students, honors students, third year students, undergraduate students, research assistants, senior and more early career fellows as experts on Australian islands, threatened species, but also just on Australian islands and on island conservation and on island management. And since Australia as a whole is an island, in this project we didn't treat Australia as an island. We actually treated it as the continent. But of course, Australia is an island, Tasmania is an island, and we have responsibility for those over 9,000 islands that Australia is managing. So we're going to move on and tell you a bit more about the outcomes and the goals of this project, which range from supporting and sharing lessons and experience among managers and practitioners across different states and across different islands. That is a very important goal that we feel we've managed to advance quite a bit as part of this big project, but it's an endless project. And we're going to continue on this into the future, creating platforms that actually allow us to better share lessons, because some solutions have been devised on certain islands, but they're often unshared. If we're better able to share amongst islands, Lord Howe has managed in the last year to not see a single rat, because last September, in a huge, huge multi-stakeholder effort led by the New South Wales government in very close collaboration with many stakeholders and of course the Lord Howe Board and many, many other partners from different sectors, they've managed to actually control and most likely get rid of all the rats that have been for hundreds of years on that unique World Heritage Island with devastating impacts on many species, and they've led to the decline and disappearance. We're learning across the islands, and we're sharing information, and we're also collaborating internationally, not only across all Australian states, working with multiple stakeholders and multiple partners across all governments, many NGOs, the public, and others. We're also working closely with many international partners, such as International Island Conservation Office and many others. So we have a lot to learn in Australia, and we also have a lot to offer to the rest of the world. So we can discuss, what has worked, what has failed in the management of introduced species and the conservation of threatened species. So for example, we had a student called Hernan who just finished his PhD a couple of years ago, and the whole PhD was focused on Stradbroke Island and how we can develop a framework for collaborating with multiple stakeholders. So if you go to the Kark Group webpage, it's karkgroup.org, you'll be able to read this paper, which was published in 2019, showing how Stradbroke Island has actually worked in a multi-stakeholder environment to prioritize action for invasive species, such as foxes and cats, that impact many threatened species, but also many culturally valuable species on the island, like pythons and koalas and other species. So these island case studies and examples have been instrumental, in advancing the study and understanding the role of islands in conservation as havens or refuges or traps for conservation. And islands have so many different complex roles that are fascinating to study, and working closely to link science and practice and to work as closely as we can with people on islands and with social scientists to actually look at the human component, climate change, sea level rise, invasive species, urbanization, extreme events like cyclones. All these have huge impact on island populations, but island populations are so dependent on the natural resources and the ecosystems within the islands where they persist. And in order to survive on those islands, we need the ecosystems to be healthy and sustainable, and we need people's activities to be sustainable. And people on islands are very often resilient, but these are huge challenges. So if we can work together among social scientists, natural scientists, conservation scientists, we can really gain from that and benefit towards the future of islands. And that's our task into the future. So we want to move to our more specific presentation where we're going to tell you about a national database of threatened species on Australian islands that Peter and I will be presenting, but other people have been collaborating with us closely on developing this um, database over the last few years, including Justine and April and Aaron and Andrew, and of course, John, who was the person who created the draft, the first template of the database, and Stephen Barnett, who provided information on birds, and Tim Doherty, who has been involved in discussions, and Sierra Legg, who gave data for invasive species. But today, what we're going to present to you is how we generated the national databases of threatened species on Australian islands, and then Peter is going to give you a demo of how to use it. So that's the goal of today's work and presentation. And the database includes both EPBC and IUCN listed terrestrial species, plants, invertebrates, freshwater fish, frogs, terrestrial reptiles, land birds, seabirds, terrestrial mammals, but we didn't include coastal animals because, that's a huge task. We do have some data for seabirds, but these were not included, though we do have case studies for these species. For example, a project we led on Heron Island on impacts of nightlights on threatened species, and on especially on sea turtles, and that was done by honor students in our lab. If you want to read his paper, which we just published, go to the Kark Group webpage and look for James Vanderstein, this paper, which was published just recently in 2020 in a journal called Remote Sensing. You can read about many of these case studies in our webpage, and just Google Scholar will also lead you to papers and others, and we'll have a list of all the products of this project very soon up on our webpage and also on the NESP threatened species webpage. So we have data for the distribution of these species, but we don't have data for points for each and every species. This is a huge task, and for most species, this data was just never collected up to now on most islands. So what we actually have is, do they occur on islands only, on the mainland only, or on both? So we focus on species that occur on islands, and we know which islands we have records for those species. So the fact that we don't have a record doesn't mean the species is not there. It means that we don't have information. Most likely the species do not occur there, but we can't guarantee that. So, we have species occurrence in the past and the present. We have some additional information for the species, and we've used data from different sources and verified that data with regional experts from the government offices, but also many, many other experts. Parks Australian, very thankful to all those experts, individuals who are experts in their fields. And the data sources, and Peter will talk a bit more about it soon, but Peter, do you want to add a bit more about the data sources that you've been using?
Sure, we used as many data sources as possible, which are listed there. And we pursued further references through the published grey literature as well soliciting experts' input into the database. And then when we compile the data, we, as much as possible, verified with regional experts. So for example, Queensland Department of Environment for species occurrence on Queensland islands and so on.
Thank you. Okay, so basically we use both published in grey literature, but we mostly verified everything with the state departments. You can see representatives of all states and many other offices, some NRMs and Parks Australia and Norfolk, of course, and our different partners on the islands, the different university experts, and really so many people. So thanks to all those people who helped us verify this information. And I'm going to pass this on to Peter, who will be presenting in a bit more detail how we've created the database, what it includes, and how to study this database and use it. If you're interested in finding out, for example, information on quokkas on Rottnest Island in Western Australia, just outside Perth, you can actually query the database and look for the island and for the quokkas, and find out more about that. If you want to know everything about the whole database, Peter will also show you how you can study the database, in a larger picture. So yeah, I'll come back a bit later. I'm going in the meanwhile to Lord Howe to snorkel a bit in this beautiful beach and beautiful reef. So go for it, Peter. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Salit. So the database is actually organized into three main tables. The first table covers over 9,000 islands that we got from it's available online from Geoscience Australia, and we got through Carl Balsard, who we'd like to acknowledge specifically, who worked for the Department of Environment. So that's publicly available Australian islands data covering geographical information such as longitude, latitude, distance from the mainland, and so on, and which states the islands occur in. So we couple that with data on all threatened species. So that's species listed as vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered under either the IUCN Red List or the EPBC Act, the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, which is Australian legislation. So that threatened species table includes species that are limited that are on islands or on mainland only or on both. So there's over 2,000 records, not all of which species occur on islands. But coupling the distribution of those species together with the information on islands, if you could just go to the next image, please, Salit, gives us the sort of composite database of island occurrences of threatened Australian species. So there's 1,260 species on island records that we have. So it's roughly considered populations, 1,260 populations. That covers over 300 species across approximately 300 islands. So thanks. The next slide, please. So this is a snapshot of which islands in Australian territory host threatened species. And you can see it ranges over the entire continent. It ranges over a huge latitudinal gradient from north to south, down as far as Macquarie Island in the south, thanks for the pointer, Salit, up as far as Bramble Cay in the north near PNG, near Papua New Guinea, and over to Christmas Island and the Cocos-Keeling Islands, and then over to, on the east side, to Lord Howe Island and Norfolk Island, as well as hundreds of islands around the Australian coastline. So that's a broad snapshot of the coverage of this database. There's hundreds of species across hundreds of islands. So now I'll walk through examples of how to use the database to get some more specific information. First, I'll talk about how to extract a list of threatened plants on all the islands that are under Commonwealth jurisdictions and not managed by states and territories, but managed by the Commonwealth itself. And next slide, thanks, Salit. We can expand that to get a distribution of what threatened species on islands occur in each taxonomic group in each state. So how many mammals on islands in Queensland, or how many reptiles on islands in Tasmania, and so on.
So if you want to access, before we move to the presentation where Peter will show you how to use the database, the database will be available, or may already be available when you're watching this, on our webpage, karkgroup.org. We're also hoping to upload it on the threatened species recovery webpage. And if you access it through here, you will have a link to projects. And under projects, there'll be an island project where you can actually access it directly. We're busy writing instructions for using the database, but you can also use this recording as an instruction, and also will advise you there how you can cite the database. So when you use it, just make sure that you read the instructions and you know how the database was structured, then you can use it correctly and enjoy it. And we're hoping this database will really allow us to advance conservation on Australian islands into the future. So yeah, thank you for that. And we want to acknowledge you, of course, for listening to us, but also, a lot of people in the Biodiversity group and people who gave data over the years, and student assistants and volunteers and consultation, with various people that we've advised, and the funding, of course, from the department. And this is the link to read a lot more about the project, and the fact sheets will describe those if you go to the link. And the webpage will be active long after, hopefully, the projects end. So we're hoping that into the future we'll have new projects to continue, because it's really key to create platforms that allow collaboration across islands amongst social and natural scientists and conservation scientists, which are quite used to integrating all these different human and natural components into the future of these ecosystems, because islands are amazing, unique, important, and valuable, but also are highly susceptible to climate change, to sea level rise, to extreme events, to invasive species, and to many, many other factors. So it is our job to ensure that our beautiful and highly important islands, for both humans and people living on islands, and for the biodiversity on islands and ecosystems, will be on a positive trajectory and will persist and be, sustained into the future. So, Peter, you're welcome to bring up your presentation, and then we'll start walking you through on how you can actually use this database that we've been working over the last few years in order for you to be able to use it and to make the best of this database. We're recording now, Peter, and you can go ahead.
Okay, thanks. So this is the database. It's in an Excel file with a few different tabs. And as I mentioned earlier, these three main tables. So I've set them up so if you can go to the, you can switch between the tables by going up to the name box at the top left here in Excel, or you can just use the colored tabs at the bottom. So for example, the islands table contains information on island ID, island name, alternative names, if it's in an island group like an archipelago, or what state it's in, and longitude and latitude and other geographical parameters. The all threatened species table contains information on the scientific name of the species.
Can you make that a bit larger, Peter?
Sure. Whether or not it's a full species.
Yeah.
Or subspecies, for example. Its common name, what taxon it is, whether it's a plant or mammal or whatever. Its status under the EPBC Act and its status under the Red List. Now, a lot of species are listed as differently under the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act than they are under the Red List, or some subspecies might be listed under one, whereas the full species is listed on the other. So we can cross-reference them by using an alias field. So if a species is under the EPBC Act named as one name, then it's it'll be indicated if it's also red listed under a different name. So this can facilitate continuous updating of the databases as both of the threatened species listings change, which happens all the time. There's also a field for whether the species occurs on the island or the mainland or both, and whether it occurs in Tasmania. We don't treat Tasmania as an oceanic island in this work, but we have noted whether they occur in Tasmania or not. Tasmania is very, very large with multiple different threats, which are quintessential, right? And the third sheet then brings the species and island information together and records populations of threatened species on islands. So it joins the island ID from the island sheet with the scientific name from the threatened species sheet. It also gives the current status of the species on that island, whether it's present, whether it's been reintroduced, if there's uncertainty about its presence, and also information on the historic status if that's of interest. And it's fully with the source of the data. So I've also included an overview sheet which expands more information about from the different tables to give a more holistic overview without detailed querying of the database. But we can show you now how to do a detailed query. So the first example I was going to talk through was to get a list of threatened plants on Commonwealth islands. So to do this, you need to have Power Pivot tools enabled in Excel. If they're not enabled, you can go to the File menu and go to the Options tab, and under Add-ins in the pop-up window, you see a drop-down menu for Manage COM add-ins. So you select there. You can just make sure the Microsoft Power Pivot for Excel is checked. So that will enable Power Pivot tables. So they're an advanced form of database lookup. So I've enabled Power Pivot and we have our three tables ready to go. So this will allow us to cross-reference each table and get more holistic results. So how we do that is we set up relationships between the tables. And we do that by first under the data tab, we can click relationships in the data tools group. So we can define new relationships. So this ties tables together. So we're going to first tie the all species table. There's its species name, its scientific name of all threatened species, into the IOTA's island threatened species scientific name. So that'll say these two are the same, and please link them together. And then we can further define a relationship between the islands table, the island ID number, with the IOTA's table, which has also the island ID number. So this will, for example, let us look up, okay, the Abutilon Juliana is on island 8774. So now we can get all the information about island 8774, for example, by setting up this relationship. So we can close that and our data model is ready to go. So in the Power Pivot tab, we can now go Manage Data Model. And it shows us the our three tables again, which are now included in the data model. We can also look at the diagram view, which basically shows us the links between the tables. So if we hover here, we can see the island ID in both IOTA's and islands table is highlighted. So that's what links these. And the scientific name in the all threatened species table is linked to the scientific name in the IOTA's table. So that's diagram view. We can go back into data view. But to do the analysis, we basically pick the pivot table tab here, and from the pivot table tab, we select the pivot table option. And it prompts us to create a new worksheet or put our results in the existing worksheet. It's much clearer to use a new worksheet to keep our workings separate. So this throws up a table or a new worksheet. Our results will go here on the left and our workings happen here over on the right. I'm just going to call this worksheet threatened plants on Commonwealth Islands. So we're going to produce a list of threatened plants on all Commonwealth Islands. So to do that, we want to make sure we only select plants that are threatened and the ones that occur on islands. So we work this by selecting fields from each of the tables. So under the all threatened species table, we want to choose specific EPBC Act status plants, so just the ones that are threatened. So we can drag that down to the filters. And we can select multiple items from this option. And we want to just select the ones that are classified as threatened, which is critically endangered, or vulnerable. Okay, so we can apply that. So now we have multiple statuses under the EPBC Act. We also want to just take plants, so we can drag taxon down and just generate a list of plants. So we could repeat this exercise to produce a list for any taxon, but we just use plants for the moment. So now this is giving us threatened plants, and we also want Commonwealth Islands. So that's island information. So under the islands table, we bring state down, and this gives us the option of what states to include. And we can just include the Commonwealth. And we see the other states that have threatened plants on them. They're listed as well. Now, also we want plants that are on the islands that are actually present or that we think are present. So this current population status under the IOTAs table, so we can drag that down as well. So the IOTAs table will have information on some that already have been extirpated or extinct on the island, or failed introduction, so they're not present on islands. So we can choose just the species that we think are on islands or we're certain are on islands. So that would be any that are introduced. So this includes species that are introduced for conservation reasons as captive breeding programs or whatever. Non-breeding just applies to seabirds, so we can ignore that. But we want present and reintroduced species, and also we'll include uncertain species, even potentially extirpated, because even though they haven't been seen recently, they might maybe there. We're just generating a list for further exploration. So we have plants on Commonwealth Islands that are threatened and that are present or we think have a high likelihood of being present on the island. So now we have to say, well, which islands are there and what species are there. So we can drag island name down to the columns, and this starts populating with all the Commonwealth threatened, all the Commonwealth islands that have threatened species. But if we bring the scientific name of the plant down, it shows all the list of threatened plants. So now we need to actually say, well, which are actually present on which islands. So we can count the scientific name. And now that reduces the list of islands to just 4 that have threatened plants. So there's Christmas Island, Nepean Island, Norfolk Island, and Phillip Island. So Nepean and Phillip are in the Norfolk Island group as well. So we got a much shorter list. And we see there's 61 populations of threatened plants. There's actually, I think, 44 threatened plants on the list. So we also have how many populations per plant species. So Apolyton julianae has 2 populations, one on Norfolk Island, one on Phillip Island, for example.
So we define population as if the species is on the island, we call it, Peter calls it population. But basically, we didn't look, at population structure, but we did look at presence, absence on islands. What is really amazing in this example, which is just, to show you how to use the database and query it, is that we can immediately see how many threatened species there are on Norfolk and even on Phillip, which is right next to Norfolk Island. And we can prioritize actions. For example, the reason Leah is doing her whole PhD on Norfolk in collaboration with people in the herbarium and parks, Australia and Norfolk Island parks, is that it's such a huge concentration of 41 different threatened plants. But in this way, where we query the database, allows us to firstly see whether, we got it right. We know how many species are there. There's a lot of missing information, of course, but we've worked very hard over the years to collect the best information available currently for the end of the year 2020 in Australia, and that will be updated into the future. So if you find more information and more details, you're welcome to email us, and the database will hopefully have a possibility to be updated into the future, but also to prioritize action. We now know how important it is to prioritize action for both Phillip and Norfolk, and that's something we've known for a long time, but we can also compare it with other islands to help us prioritize action. And with limited funds, that's very, very important. So thanks for that example, Peter. I think it was very helpful and clear.
Great, you're welcome. Yeah.
You can go on.
So we've counted the scientific names, but we've seen that there's some duplicates. So we can actually do a distinct count as well of scientific name to get a species level view. So if we choose distinct count from the value field settings, it changes. So all the values in this grand total column here change to 1. It's just saying, yes, the species is threatened and present on a Commonwealth island. So now we see the species count is actually 44, whereas there was 61 island occurrences in total. So that's some nuance of just producing a list of threatened plants on Commonwealth islands. We can see as well some plants only occur on one island, so that might indicate endemism and particular attention as well if they don't occur on the mainland. So we can move to our second example, which is to produce a state by taxon species count. So how many mammals are in Queensland, or how many reptiles are in Tasmania, or how many freshwater fish are in Tasmania, and so on. So we can repeat the previous steps, setting up a data model, or we could just copy this and change it, but I'll walk through the steps again. So we can go manage our data model and go pivot table and generate a new one in a further new worksheet. So we can see the same template is produced again. So we can repeat the steps as before. We're interested this time in all taxa. So we'll call that taxa by state.
Thank you.
Be state or territory or Commonwealth jurisdiction either. It gives us an insight into an overview of taxonomic and spatial spread of threatened island species in Australia. So again, we can choose EPBC Act status, and we can choose just the threatened species. There are some species that have, even though it's a threatened species database, some species will show up as blank threatened status under EPBC Act, and these will be threatened under the IUCN. But we just concentrate on one organizational tool for the moment. So on the islands table, then we'd like to group by state. So put that down in the columns so we see all the states occurring there. And under this threatened species table, we'll want the taxon information to group by taxa. So this is the sort of table we're going to get, is like fish in the Commonwealth, or freshwater fish in Queensland, and so on. But similarly to the previous example, we'll also look at which species are actually occurring on islands, and so the current population status. So let's make the same selections as we did before for those. So we'll take those conservation introductions, the potentially extirpated, present, reintroduced, and even the uncertain ones. There's quite a lot of uncertain records. They have prior records of occurring on an island, but there hasn't been recent surveys. So this category could actually be a good guide to direct future monitoring efforts as well. So now that all that remains is to count the species. So we can count their scientific name as before. So if we do a count, this is counting populations, as before we saw the plants in the Commonwealth Islands where there's some overlap. So a mammal may occur in more than one state, for example. So this tells us there's 457 populations of threatened species that are threatened under the EPBC Act that occur on islands. We can count exactly how many species are represented by that by doing a distinct count. So this doesn't double count species that occur in more than one state. So there's 242 species that occur on islands, and we can see it quite an interstate taxon interplay. Many plants occur on Commonwealth Islands. That's why it was a nice example to produce a long list from earlier. Mammals we can see occur a lot on Queensland and Northern Territory Islands in Western Australia. So the northern part of Australia tends to host most mammal species, including threatened species like the northern quail, which has quite a strong representation across those islands. And so we can see emerging patterns that plants have most of the threatened species under the EPBC Act are plants. And because of that high level of threatened plants in Norfolk Island, the Commonwealth has the richest proportion of threatened species, followed by Tasmania. So that's just another quick example of how to get an overview of how threatened species are allotted across space and across a taxonomic group. I'll hand back to you. Thanks, Salit.
Thank you, everyone. And remember, this database will be all our information, our fact sheets and descriptions of the project and everything is under this webpage, nesthreatenedspecies.edu.au. And then if you want to find the database, you can find it here under database access and information in www.karkgroup.org under projects in the island project component. So we're gonna go back to the beach, Lord how. And we have beautiful islands in Australia and many unique species that we have responsibility to protect. And we're hoping that our work on islands and the collaborations that have developed will lead into future platforms and collaborations, which will allow to share information and to work to save our threatened species on islands and to try and address the multiple threats that they're facing in the face of global change, regional change, and local changes. But go to those islands, enjoy them, and help us protect those species on Australian islands. Thank you to everyone who's been part of this project and who still is. And enjoy your day and the use of this database. And thank you again.